Welcome everyone and welcome back. We now proceed to the last discussion of the day. Dr. Gavin, the floor is yours, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome you all back again. For those of us just joining us, it's our pleasure to welcome you to CILE's 8th International Conference in collaboration this time with Leuven University on key classical works in Islamic ethics. Our particular session here is revolving around Sufi ethics. We've already had 2 excellent talks and a fantastic discussion, and I expect to have the same type of response from you in this session, because we are going to move forward, historically speaking, chronologically to a few centuries to the period of Imam al-Ghazali and later Ibn Taymiyyah, both with very differing views, as I'm sure you might be aware, on the notion of both ethics and Sufism. So to begin with, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Tenali Kukkonen, who is Professor of Philosophy at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Before joining NYUAD, he was a professor and had a standing faculty position in universities in Canada, Finland, and New Zealand. So he's well-traveled. He specializes in classical Arabic philosophy, Aristotle, and the Aristotelian and Platonic traditions from antiquity to the Renaissance. He also has interests in philosophy and pop culture, religious studies, Islamic culture in the classical period, and the early history of science. By his own admission, Professor Kukkonen is an avid reader of comic books and lives on music and chocolate. As for his music, I cannot comment, but his love of chocolate I can certainly vouch for, because he is an esteemed colleague and an old friend, and it's a real pleasure to see him here in this conference. He's the author of Ibn Tufayl, published by Oxford in 2014, and has over 30 research articles on Arabic philosophy and the Aristotelian tradition. For those following his work, you will be aware that he has basically single-handedly informed our knowledge on Imam al-Ghazali's epistemological framework. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Kukkonen to speak on the topic of al-Ghazali's Ihya, virtue and happiness.
Thank you so much, Gavin, and also many thanks to the organizers of this incredible conference. I've learned a tremendous amount throughout the past 2 days already. And I'm very much afraid that having heard every other presenter already refer to Imam al-Ghazali one place or another, that little that I have to say today will much illuminate anybody's thinking anymore. But let's see how this goes. First, 2 quick apologies. One is that as we enter the discussion period, I have to admit that even under the best of circumstances, my conversational Arabic would be non-existent. So I do have to ask that you present your questions in sort of, I suppose, English, German, Swedish would work, as well as Finnish for all of those Finns in attendance. And the second apology is that these are really not the best of circumstances for me to be presenting, because I'm 11 time zones behind Qatar. So I have in fact been up since 2 a.m. here. It's now closing in on 7 a.m. So if I start to act delirious, I wish I could say that it's because I've all of a sudden achieved some kind of cash, but that's unlikely to be the case. Okay, so here goes. Let's see now. I have notes here from which I'll begin and then begin to veer from them as we go on. Okay, so recent scholarly work on Abu Hamid al-Ghazali has produced a wealth of studies relating to his metaphysics, cosmology, epistemology, and logic, as well as his legal and political views. With all that, I think we do well to be reminded with George Horani that al-Ghazali's, and I quote, central concern throughout his life may fairly be described as an ethical one. Right conduct and the purification of the soul by the individual as means to a harmonious relation with God and the attainment of everlasting joy. That's from Horani on Ghazali and the Ethics of Action, and it's as wonderful and concise a kind of distillation of Al-Ghazali as I can find anywhere. Now, this characterization may seem so commonsensical as to appear unnecessary. After all, what could be more evident than that Al-Ghazali is invested in how we are to live? There's nary an account of Al-Ghazali's life and career, after all, that would not emphasize, just as the man himself did, that ilm needs to be balanced by amal, or a thirst for the truth balanced by a commitment to righteous living. Yet it is worth, in my opinion, pausing to consider what it would mean to take seriously what Hourani says here. If the ethical imperative truly was central to Al-Ghazali, then one would expect to find in his works not only an abundance of materials relating to right conduct and the purification of the soul, as per Hourani, and as of course one does. One might also expect to find in the pages put out by Al-Ghazali serious and sustained thinking on ethics, ethical theorizing, that is to say. This should, by all accounts, then match in sophistication and scope what Al-Ghazali contributed to those theoretical topics that have so now exercised the imagination of recent scholars, especially coming from the philosophical side. And we would expect then consequently also to find among Al-Ghazali scholars an equivalent interest in engaging with and tackling with his ethics. Or to put it another way, if we are serious about the notion that Al-Ghazali was primarily an ethicist, and this is, for instance, my good colleague and friend Frank Griffel has said this to me many times, then should we not seek to understand how his ethics are supposed to work and how they're put together? Yet, if such is our expectation, then recent scholarship will serve mostly to frustrate us, and to a degree that's frankly surprising. Monograph-length studies on Al-Ghazali's ethics that date back to the 50s to the 70s, I'm thinking of Umar al-Din, Sharif, and Qasim. These are quite valuable in many ways still, but they veer more towards the descriptive and expository. More recent studies primarily add context, insofar it is now much more common to evoke the full scope of the many debts that Al-Ghazali owes to earlier authors. So it's these days, let's think about something like Tim Winter's introduction to his translation of the 22nd book of the Ihya on disciplining the soul, where Winter rolls off quickly a list of influences ranging from Plato, Aristotle, and the Galenic medical tradition to various Islamic spiritual authors and the legal traditions, right? So we certainly have a much less, let's say, reductive approach, and we've gained a much greater understanding of everything that went into the pot when it comes to Al-Ghazali's synthesis. But all of this, it seems again to just give an impression of a kind of a big kind of soup of stuff, instead of an approach that would seek to look at what Al-Ghazali does with these materials. And while we do have a few individual studies that analyze one aspect or another of Al-Ghazali's ethics, typically pitting the Greek philosophical tradition against the Asharite normative kind of theorizing, none of these, as far as I can tell, provide any kind of comprehensive overview. I'm thinking of people like Anwar Iman, who had a section on Al-Ghazali in his Islamic natural law theories, or Sofia Vasalu, who did a wonderful little piece on greatness of the soul in Al-Ghazali, which I thought was incredibly illuminating, but still a very kind of microscopic contribution. And so it's here that I believe it can prove helpful to study Al-Ghazali's revival of the religious sciences, what's after all termed his magnum opus, in a frame that foregrounds its ethical component. Now, in so doing, I think one has to take some kind of stand vis-a-vis how much an earlier treatise of Al-Ghazali's, The Scale of Action, the Mizan al-Amal, can or cannot throw light on the revival, which is often regarded as being a bit sprawling and unruly, whereas the Mizan is pretty straightforward and concise in its presentation. And one must likewise question what, if anything, we can gain from reading the revival in light of Al-Ghazali's later theorization in writings such as his treatise on God's beautiful names, the Maqsar al-Asna, or for that matter, his autobiography, the Munqidh min ad-Dalal. But I thought that it was really a kind of a welcome challenge in the context of this conference to take the Ihya basically as it's kind of, as a self-standing work, and then address these other works of Al-Ghazali's only in a kind of a sort of a diagonal way, if you will. So as to kind of think about, okay, so what kind of testimonial does the Ihya itself provide, taken as a whole and in its more revealing parts. And so with this, I'd like to proceed in the 15 minutes or so that I have to me to present some very, very preliminary observations. Again, much of what I say is going to be painfully familiar to many, if not most of those in attendance, and I apologize already if I'm just kind of going to be rehearsing very familiar things. I hope that towards the end I'll have time to point to a couple of interesting features in what Al-Ghazali has to say and what he, in my estimation, is wanting to do in this work. And for this, I'll already point out that I wrote for a Nordic journal in religious studies called Numen, an article that came out in 2016 on Al-Ghazali on the origins of ethics that sketches out an interpretation of Al-Ghazali's Munqidh and what Al-Ghazali says in the Munqidh on the Ilm al-Akhlaq, which I think is nothing else novel. I don't think that anybody believes what I've said there. Which I think is a good sign that I've at least said something moderately interesting. Okay, but today again, mostly about the Ihya. All right, so first of all, a couple of really, really familiar basic things to establish. The revival divides into 4 quarters of roughly equal length and 10 books each, and all 4 of those quarters deal with what might be termed ethical matters if we construe that term in perfectly kind of in a perfectly everyday and ordinary way. So first we've got the acts of worship, the ibadat. Then we've got ordinary kind of customs insofar as as God takes an interest and has prescribed things in that regard, the adat. And then third quarter focuses on the destructive character traits, and the fourth one on the salvific character traits. Now, Al-Ghazali himself describes the revival as being a work devoted to the science of action, the Ilm al-Mu'amala, which is half of the science of the path of the hereafter, and stands in contrast to the other half of that path of the hereafter, which is the science of unveiling. This again is just by way of framing the subject matter. So the revival as a whole is supposed to elucidate in kind of a novel fashion, and there's no gainsaying the kind of the transformative work that Al-Ghazali aims to be putting forward and purports to be putting forward in the revival, how he's wanting to frame now this science of action in a way that proceeds beyond what was available in the disciplines of his time. So this is, of course, a kind of a function of this being the kind of the opening salvo of his project after having left Baghdad and his professorship in the Nizamiya College in 488 or 1095. So the Ilm al-Mu'amala presents this incredible hodgepodge of materials related again to how we are to live our lives or how Muslims are to live their lives in order for them to progress on the way to becoming then privy then to this science of the unveiling. Now I won't here do anything other than to just point in the direction of all the work that's been done by various scholars in figuring out what that overall project might look like. There's been work that I found immensely illuminating, even though I haven't I'm not fully on board with what pretty much any of my good colleagues has said on this matter, and I'll just have to bide my time in figuring out what I myself want to say about now precisely this revival project. I'll just refer here to people like Timothy Gianotti and Jules Janssens and Ken Garden and so on, who've each weighed in on what this looks like. But here's a kind of a preliminary observation that the first 2 quarters, of course, again, deal with simply kind of weighing in on how certain kinds of acts are to be framed, how they're to be understood, how they're going to be performed. And here, Al-Ghazali draws on the foregone tradition, both in terms of the existing kind of legal schools, as well as just kind of descriptions of how the various Muslims from various points of time, starting from the Prophet and proceeding through the companions and going on to various kinds of spiritual authorities and so on, how they managed their affairs, whether these were the acts of worship or everyday conduct. And when you hear the common refrain that, okay, that this thing that was encapsulated even in writing somewhere, that, okay, if we lost all the other books on Islam and we were left with the revival, we'd be kind of okay. I take it that a lot of that has to do with the idea, again, that those 2 first quarters present a kind of a good cross-section of all of these materials that exist. The kind of the middle way that Al-Ghazali often describes in not too much, not too little, in terms of the stringency of the requirements for having performed these acts in a satisfactory manner and so on. They're pretty light on kind of legalistic mechanics, while at the same time alluding to those mechanics in a sort of a way that would not offend many sensibilities and so on. But it tends to be material that's passed over by again kind of present day scholars who are looking at Al-Ghazali from a kind of an intellectual history of ideas kind of way, because its theoretical aspects are pretty much kind of subterranean, if you will. When Al-Ghazali treats the secrets of the various ritual acts, I think he actually says very many interesting things about the theoretical undercurrent to how he frames this work. But it's not always easy to see. What present day scholars are looking at often is the second half of the Ihya. So the 3rd and the 4th quarters, which have to do with what is, after all, kind of a pretty comprehensive presentation of a certain kind of ilm al-akhlaq, even though Al-Ghazali reframes this in terms of it being a kind of a science of let's say of the states of the heart and so on instead. And of course, this is what points then to some of the materials from which he draws, because we have on the one hand the kind of the ample Sufi and pre-Sufi materials, if you will, in terms of the treatment of character and character formation and so on, that comes from the Islamic tradition. And on the other hand, we've got the sort of the workings, the theorization that comes from very clearly the Falsafa tradition, as well as its implementation in the medical tradition as well, where through Galen there's a philosophizing understanding of what the kind of the science of the soul does and moral psychology does in association with also the physician's task. Okay, so and because of this, of course, what often gets said is that Al-Ghazali in the revival, what he presents ultimately is a kind of a virtue ethics. And of course, insofar as one has to say something, that's at once obviously correct and at the same time blatantly insufficient, because there's no way it doesn't do much to say that, okay, Al-Ghazali is presenting a virtue ethics when virtue ethics means so many different things to many different people, depending again whether you're looking at, let's say, Confucian virtue ethics or Sufi virtue ethics or Aristotelian virtue ethics or contemporary kind of Anscomian virtue ethics or something like that. So what kind of virtue ethics are we dealing with here? And here I think the principal finding, of course, is to say that in Al-Ghazali, the virtues are not treated as an end in their own right in the Ihya. And I think this is really interesting and it's worth noticing. The virtues are a kind of a training ground to, in a sense, to temper the soul in a way that allows the soul to enjoy its original, human soul to enjoy its original purpose, which is the contemplation of God and God's works. So the virtues are in service of felicity, happiness, sa'ala. So it is very clearly a form of eudaimonistic virtue ethics. If it is a virtue ethics, it's a eudaimonistic virtue ethics. And this then leads to a kind of a first fork in the road, which I think is really interesting when looking at Al-Ghazali, which is that when Al-Ghazali tries to peg his version of eudaimonism in a certain kind of anthropology, he, of course, in his naturalism is one of a fundamentally positive character, which is to say that the human being has been constituted in a healthy way all the way through, whether we're looking at of course, the human being's highest purpose, which is, again, contemplation of divinity, drawing nearer to God, and so on. But also then when it comes to the so to speak, the lower parts of the soul, the appetitive and even the irascible part of the soul, they have their work to do in this world at the very least. And therefore the satisfaction that appetite finds in things like, let's say, marriage, it's okay. Appetite in eating, there's a whole book of course, on kind of, on training these matters which is the book 23 in the Ihya, which has to do again with hunger and abstinence and so on. Or sort of abstinence specifically in the realm of sexual desire. But then when you contrast that with the books on eating and on marriage, specifically in the second quarter, you might be struck with a kind of a push and pull here. And this, of course, is what leads people to ask after Al-Ghazali's elitism. Are there two sets of instructions for those people who are not incapable of aspiring to an intellectual life or a contemplative life, and who find satisfaction in regulating the lower parts of their souls in a sort of an orderly manner, and then the more perfectionist type that's available then to the elect, so to speak, or even the elect among the elect. And that's all kind of I think fertile grounds to be thinking about certain aspects of Al-Ghazali's thought. I want to at least very, very briefly address something that's to me at least as intriguing in looking at what Al-Ghazali is doing and the slightly more nuanced ways in which he operates. And that's this. Al-Ghazali, and this is going to his other works, Al-Ghazali in the Mizan, prior to leaving Baghdad, had sketched a sort of a very highly structured version of an ilm al-akhlaq that says almost everything that I've said so far. And that clearly does present a very kind of two-tiered elitist version of what kinds of avenues are open for different kinds of people. But the question is, why did he feel the need to go then from the Mizan to writing a much more voluminous work such as the Revival, the Ihya? And I've tried to establish this in a couple of my work so far. My best sense of what's going on here is that Al-Ghazali, the Al-Ghazali of the Mizan would have to acknowledge that, okay, somebody like Ibn Sina would be just fine in saying that, okay, the philosophers can get all they need for their kind of ethical advancement from the raw use of reason, and there's no special reason to privilege revelation or the following of the divinely revealed law, except just as a kind of a demonstration of the perfection that they've already achieved. Whereas in the Ihya, one strand that comes through loud and clear and that gets then developed much more closely in certain subsequent works is the notion that in the divine law there are, again, asrar, there are secrets, as well as in the instruction provided by spiritual masters such as the Sufis, that pure reason does not reach. And that this has to do with the fact that our individual constitutions as human beings are endlessly mutable and kind of individually particularized and varied. That's the, one thinks here of passages such as the ones in the work on disciplining the soul, where Al-Ghazali says that the able master always looks at the circumstances and the person to whom different kinds of medicines are administered, that the medicine that is useful to one person will kill another. So when using this pretty kind of nuanced and sort of in a sense fine-grained framework of what I would think of as Aristotelian virtue ethics, where the mean is difficult to ascertain in any given situation. If you're thinking that you're looking at identifying the mean between two different kind of opposing vices, when Al-Ghazali finds in the Aristotelian tradition the notion that okay, the mean might mean different things for different people at different times, and when he finds furthermore in the Galenic tradition a very highly articulated understanding of how people's just temperamental constitution, their psychophysiology determines that, for one thing, I live on chocolate. Therefore, one should really put away the chocolates from my reach, because I cannot control myself. I should never ever lead myself to temptation by having a cupboard full of chocolate, because it will not be there tomorrow morning. I can guarantee you. If there's a cupboard full of chocolate there tonight, after this night has ended, there will be nothing. But somebody else might be just fine with this. They wouldn't have my stomach. They might have other temptations. Because of this, the philosophical tradition which deals in universals is not able to actually reach everybody in the same manner. And this is what comes through, is the idea that okay, that the rak'ahs, let's say, of the morning prayer have a quasi kind of magical. It's not arbitrary, but it refers to the actual secrets in nature. It has a kind of a quasi-magical power that will speak to each and every individual in a way that we're not able to explicate, but we're able to verify in our lives. And this is furthermore, and this is where I'll have to stop because I'm already over time, I'm painfully aware. This is where then also the kind of the divinely prescribed nature of revelation comes in, which is to say, this is where virtue ethics meets divine command ethics, so to speak, which is to say that the reason that we just have to take the prescriptions of the divine law as they are, as saying that, look, God's wisdom is not our wisdom, nor will it ever be, provides Al-Ghazali with the bridge to really articulate why he thinks that both the prophetic traditions and the kind of the various kinds of spiritual orders are necessary in order for each of us to get on the path of them, then eventually being in a position to reach those disclosures that illuminate for us why we were given this path to tread. That's where I have to end. I'm afraid that I would have a lot more to say, but maybe the eventual text that will result will have time for that. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Tanali. It's always a pleasure to hear from you, especially on the intriguing topic of Imam al-Ghazali's virtue ethics. I'd just like to remind the attendees that you can ask your questions in the Q&A box by typing them there. And if you have a particular speaker in mind that you would like to address a question to, please feel free to do so. Also for our participants, as you have been doing on a regular basis, if you have any questions for the speakers as well, please feel free to type your questions in the chat area for participants. Our next speaker is Dr. Arjan Post. He is an assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic studies at our co-partner for this event, Leuven University. He studied Middle Eastern studies in Leiden and pursued his PhD at Utrecht University. In his first monograph, The Journeys of a Taymiyan Sufi on the Life and Teachings of the Hanbali Sufi Al-Wasiti, has just been published by Brill in September this year, in the series Studies on Sufism, which everyone should be reading if they're attending this session. His fields of interest include Sufism, Kalam theology, and the intellectual history of the Hanbali school, in relations to which he's published several articles on Sufism in Ibn Taymiyyah's circle. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Post to speak about Ibn Taymiyyah's Al-Tuhfa al-Iraqiyya, defining an ethical framework for Sufi states and stations.
Thank you very much, Professor Kukkonen. Can you all hear me like this? Is the sound okay? Yeah, okay. So let me start off by thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. It's also very nice for me to go back to this particular book because I read Al-Tuhfa al-Iraqiyya several years ago. In fact, when I started my PhD, my initial plan was to focus on Ibn Taymiyyah's relationship to Sufism. And I felt that the Tuhfa would be something of a revelation in opening up Ibn Taymiyyah's own ideas on Sufism. And I was quite disappointed that it wasn't as spectacular as I hoped. That's maybe for reasons that I was not yet I was not really well known enough with Ibn Taymiyyah's overall thought. And that's actually the reason why now it's quite exciting for me, because reading the book again showed me that now that I've become a bit more familiarized with Ibn Taymiyyah's overall ideas and several basic assumptions that he puts forth in many of his writings, they can also be found in this book. And that's something I want to highlight in this talk as well. So I'll be beginning by giving something of a background to the book, and then briefly discuss the style of the book and the contents. And the main focus in my talk today will be a case study on trusting God, tawakkul. So let me begin by giving some background. So I used this very nice edition that you see here on the picture. It's a critical edition of the book by Ihya al-Hunaydi. It's quite lengthy in part also because there's a big introduction and a lot of footnotes, a good critical apparatus, and the takhrij of hadith and biographies of people cited. So if you look, for instance, in the Majmu' Fatawa, you will see that Tuhfa is the first book in volume 10 in Kitab al-Suluk, and there it's about 85 pages. So it's relatively long, but it's not by far his longest work, of course. But it does give a good impression of the Sheikh's ideas. So talking about the Sheikh's ideas, I will discuss some of the basic things, but I assume that Ibn Taymiyyah needs no introduction here. So the book itself, the title, Al-Tuhfa al-Iraqiyya, which can be rendered as the Iraqi gift. We know practically nothing about the background of the book, except that it was written after, like in an earlier presentation we had today, someone asked the Sheikh to write a book about the states and stations, which I will also discuss what are meant by that. So yeah, and this was what he did. He wrote Al-Tuhfa al-Iraqiyya, and the title itself indicates probably that the person who asked the question was originally from Iraq. And he has several works like this where that were written after a request, and the requestee, the origins of the requestee are inserted into the title. Like for instance, al-Aqida al-Wasitiyya, which was written after a request from a Qadi from Wasit, a city in southern Iraq. So the book, other than that, nothing is known of the context of the book. I haven't been able to date the book either, as is the case in most of Ibn Taymiyyah's works, but his corpus is so enormous that it's an impossible task to start dating his works. But I can already reveal that he's really quite consistent in the book when we compare it to his other overall ideas. So it's another testament to the great consistency of Ibn Taymiyyah. In that sense, there's not really a big something that really surprises the reader who knows Ibn Taymiyyah. So also in terms of academic research, a lot of the main pillars that supports the way he discusses the ahwal and maqamat, those are well known and they have been researched. So this book is not meant to sort of prove that he was a Sufi, because I think that question has been dealt with quite thoroughly, so I won't discuss that. What I do think is an interesting question is, should this be considered something of a Sufi treatise? So not saying that Ibn Taymiyyah was a Sufi, but did he write something on Sufism in this by writing this book? So that's an interesting question, I think, in a sense. It connects to the methodology I want to use to analyze my own findings. So I will get to that in a minute. But let me first briefly say something about this issue of ahwal and maqamat. So I think this is probably well known by now. I mean, we had a whole day of sessions on Sufism and Tasawwuf. So the hal, the state, and the maqam, the station, are sometimes differently explained. As one explanation that I think Ibn Taymiyyah is using as well is that these ahwal and maqamat, they refer actually to inward deeds. That's why the undertitle is fil a'mal al-qalbiyya, so the deeds of the heart. So one has outward deeds, one does the salat, the ritual prayer with the body, but there are inward qualities that one should realize to be a good Muslim, and those are the deeds of the heart. So the movement that you make inwardly to be a better Muslim, basically. And those result in certain qualities, and if such a quality is mastered only for a short time, then it's a hal, and if it's mastered indefinitely, then it's a maqam. That's an explanation one often finds. So how does Ibn Taymiyyah approach this? We will get to that, but how do I try to view his approach? Here I'm very much indebted to the work of my esteemed colleagues in the field of Taymiyyan studies. John Hoover, for instance, in his recent book about Ibn Taymiyyah, which is a very good introduction actually, there he states that what matters to Ibn Taymiyyah is a spirituality in conformity to the revealed law, to the Sharia. So that's in relation to Sufism specifically. But for John Hoover, actually, the way Ibn Taymiyyah looks at all these different sciences is always through the prisma of the Sharia. So everything is connected in that sense. And I think that's also related to the point that was made by Dr. Uwaymir Anjum yesterday. And I spoke with him briefly about this. And I think I'm pretty much on the same page with what he has said about that in previous publications, where he feels, for instance, that Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, and the same goes for Ibn Taymiyyah, that their idea of epistemology is that there isn't a different branch of knowledge in Sufism. The knowledge that is produced under the title of Sufism should be in accordance with knowledge of Sharia, always within the boundaries of the revealed law. So I think, perhaps stating it somewhat differently, I think John Hoover and Uwaymir Anjum are pretty much on the same page here, and I want to use their approach here to also look at Al-Tuhfa al-Iraqiyya. So let me get to the style. The style of the book is very much what you would expect from Ibn Taymiyyah. He has a lot of citations from Quran and Hadith, and I put one page here just to show you There are many pages filled like this with citations from the Quran. And of course, it's not a strange thing to have a book by a scholar with citations from the Quran and Hadith. What is particularly interesting for a scholar like Ibn Taymiyyah, and I think this is basically what I would call a traditionalist style of writing, is that they don't frequently refer to other authorities. So here, when Ibn Taymiyyah is talking about ahwal and maqamat, perhaps you would expect that he's referring a lot to Sufi scholars, or even indirectly, and he doesn't really do that. He doesn't rely on Sufis for his ideas. He has his own vision, his own methodology, and mostly when he refers to other authorities, it's in discussions about topics branching from the overall topic. So he refers a few times to his own writings, 6 times I've counted, most times without giving a title, but on 2 occasions he did provide a title. I found him referring to 9 authorities by name who are Sufis or proto-Sufis, and actually the majority of those are mentioned in reference to Sama', to refute Sama'. He refers to Sufi books twice, and that will come back in the discussion today, and twice to juridical opinions of Sufyan al-Thawri and of Shafi'i. And then he refers a few times to sects and groups like the Khawarij, sometimes to anthropomorphists, like he doesn't really name a particular group, he calls them al-Tashbih, I think. And to the Mutakallimun as Ahl Ta'atil, and to the Jahmiyyah by name, really. So in most instances, basically what you see is that he doesn't name names, which is also interesting, I think, in itself. But this is his typical style, I would argue. So let's come to the content. Of course, this doesn't represent the full scope of discussions that Ibn Taymiyyah presents, but this gives an overview specifically related to the purpose of the book, namely the maqamat and the ahwal. So all these qualities that we find here, they are related to, they are those maqamat and ahwal. So each quality can be a hal or a maqam. So he begins in the introduction first to say that ahwal and maqamat are a necessary part of the religion, which is perhaps for some people surprising, but for him it was natural that this was the case. Then briefly he discusses friendship with God, wilaya, which is closely related to several of the discussions, among others the discussion I will have today. Then he discusses truthfulness and sincerity pretty much together. And then he has 3 fasls. And in the first fasl he discusses a lot of different stations. So sorrow, trust, renunciation, uprightness, contentment, patience, gratitude, and love. And he ends the fasl with love. And that takes him to the next fasl where he spends the majority of his time only discussing love. And this takes him also to a discussion on fana, but fana is not, he never gets to baqa, but he also has other works where he discusses the relationship between fana and baqa. And in the last fasl, he comes back to khawf, to fear and hope. But again, he ties it in with mahabba, with love. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, love is obviously a central element of faith. And again, this is what I'm saying here is nothing new. This has been established by various scholars already. I think going back already to the earlier 20th century scholars of the Hanbali school, knowing about these things. So this is nothing new in itself. For today, like I said, I want to focus on tawakkul. And the term isti'ana, which he connects to tawakkul, which is asking for help. So to understand this case study, let me get to a discussion that Ibn Taymiyyah is presenting here. He's saying what should be the correct status of tawakkul. That's what he wants to establish when he discusses this particular hal or maqam. And he says that the authors of 2 Sufi books, and he doesn't mention the name, but he mentions the title of the book, Ilal al-Maqamat and then Mahazin al-Majalis. He says that they have made a mistake when it comes to the issue of tawakkul. And actually the authors are Abdullah al-Ansari, the famous Hanbali Shaykh, and Ibn al-Arif. So I guess that's something of a courtesy of Ibn Taymiyyah not naming them, and that way being a good Sufi in a sense. But yeah, he was right. because what he's saying, the comment that he has regarding their opinion is that they say that tawakkul is only for the generality, for the common believers. So we see that here. This is the fragment of Ilal al-Maqamat, where indeed it says وَأَمَا التَّوَكُّلُ فَإِنَّهُ لِلْأَعْوَامِ. So tawakkul is for the generality, for the common people. And we find the same in the book of Ibn al-Arif. So here, وَأَمَّا التَّوَكُّلُ فَإِنَّهُ لِلْعَوَامِ أَيْضًا. So to understand Ibn Taymiyyah's discussion, he relates it back to his earlier discussion in the Tuhfa on the wilaya, on friendship with God. He says there are basically two types of awliya, two types of friends of God. We have the generality and we have the khas, the elect. And he, rather than using this famous Sufi terminology like the Abdal, the Awtad, and the Qutub, and these kinds of terms, he relies solely on Quranic terms. So the generality are the Qasidun, or the companions of the right, the Ashab al-Yamin, and the elect are the forerunners drawn near, As-Sabiqun al-Muqarrabun, as mentioned in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, among others. So the fact that they are described as Muqarrabun, as being drawn near to God, that makes them elect in a sense. So there is something of a hierarchy there, I would argue, but it's strictly in Quranic terms. And what's the difference between these two degrees of wilaya? It's basically in the famous hadith, the hadith Qudsi that we see here, a hadith that's almost cited by practically all Sufi books, I would say, or Sufi manuals, I should say. Not each and every Sufi book cites this hadith, but many Sufi manuals always refer to this hadith. It's an important one because it says something about the awliya, and God says, in this hadith, I've declared war on anyone who shows enmity to a friend of mine. My servant does not draw near to me with anything I love more than what I've made obligatory on him, and my servant continues to draw near to me with supererogatory actions, the nawafil, until I love him, hatta uhibbahu. So this is the basis for the distinction between the two forms of wilaya, with the generality of the awliya only upholding the fara'id, the obligatory acts of worship, but the khawas, the elites or the elect, also doing the nawafil. This is basically the difference between them. Now, another aspect that's important to understand is the division between ilahiyya or uluhiyya and rububiyya. And this is based on Al-Fatiha, on Iyyaka na'budu wa Iyyaka nasta'in. So this is also a well-known aspect of Ibn Taymiyyah's doctrine. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, Iyyaka na'budu, you alone we serve. This refers to worshiping to God as the object of worship, and which means that we as human beings should worship God. The second half of the verse, you alone we ask for help, wa Iyyaka nasta'in. This refers to God being the director of the universe. So this is God's rububiyyah, God in the form of a Rabb. And here, the form of worship that we as human beings should have, among other things, is trusting in God, because He is the one who is directing the universe, and asking for help, because He, in the end, is the creator of everything. So, in the end, we can only go back to Him. So, in that sense, he says, these two aspects of being a Muslim, they're not for the awam only, and they're not for the khawas only, they're for each and every Muslim. And the difference between the elite and the common Muslim is simply that the elite is also doing the nawafid and is perfecting him or herself in that sense. But in the end, all the maqams and ahwal that one should try to attain, these are meant for each and every Muslim, not only for the elites of the awliya. So the perfect Muslim should be able to internalize and fully realize both rububiyyah and uluhiyya, so both worship of God and fully realizing that God is directing the universe in His rububiyyah. So this is basically the core issue of Ibn Taymiyyah's ontology and epistemology, I would say. And this takes me to the conclusion where we see that for Ibn Taymiyyah, this whole issue of tawakkul as a state, he understands it from his perspective, from his methodology, and I would say indeed epistemological methodology. So what he tries to do in the Tuhfa is to give a correct understanding of the states and stations, always within the boundaries of Sharia. So, in a sense, going back to what I said in the introduction of what John Hoover and Uwaymir Anjum have elaborated upon the overall methodology of Ibn Taymiyyah in that sense. So I think this really goes very well for this particular book and able to understand what is Ibn Taymiyyah trying to do here. In that sense, it's not a Sufi manual. Rather, he's trying to anchor these terms that are indeed often considered Sufi terms, were probably very much integrated into the context of his time. He's trying to sort of making them correcting them in the sense of anchoring them in the Sharia. So in the article that I want to write about this, of course, I will give much more examples because especially from the parts on Mahabba, there's a lot more interesting stuff to elaborate upon. But this, for such a short talk, I just decided to go with Tawakkul for today. So that's it basically. That was my presentation. 1 minute over time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arjan. So in other words, you relied on Tawakkul. Yes,
I have Tawakkul. But I think it's only a hal and not a maqam.
Let's hope it becomes one, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. The question and answers haven't produced anything, and our colleagues have not been active as yet. I'm sure that during the course of the questions, they may have more. So with regard to Dr. Tunneli, one question I may ask him is, how do you view, I mean, you're much more familiar than most of us with Imam al-Ghazali's works, and you mentioned here the idea of the Mizan al-Amal. I was wondering what you think about this as a text in terms of its authenticity of attribution, and how useful, if it is authentic, to the overall scheme of Ibn Taymiyyah's, Imam al-Ghazali's virtue ethics. So that's a question for Dr. Tunneli. And for Dr. Arjan, what I would like to ask him, so basically Ibn Taymiyyah is saying everyone should be a Sufi. Or is he suggesting something else here? And I'm wondering, I mean, with the Madarij al-Salikin of Ibn al-Qayyim, which of course we have an expert in the audience, and with the various works of Al-Ansari of Herat, and with Ibn Taymiyyah, can we identify some kind of Hanbali Sufism here? Is there a consistent thread of thinking in that regard, a consistent epistemology perhaps? So Dr. Tunneli.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay, so I was quite struck when I read the views that came from a few quarters. I suppose William Montgomery Watt above all, disputing the authenticity of the Mizan, and so I gave some thought to that kind of proposition, and I came down on the side, both in terms of kind of external references to the work in Al-Ghazali's own kind of other writings, and then internal factors, to think that I don't see any reason to dispute its authenticity or its attribution as being a work that was written, again, in just prior to Al-Ghazali leaving Baghdad. And so this is something that let's say, Ken Garden, for instance, is basing a lot on when it comes to his interpretation of how things go. And of course, Garden famously in the work, The First Islamic Reviver, presents a picture where Al-Ghazali, in a sense, already says that almost everything that he needs to say in the Mizan, and then he's just figuring out how to package this for a broader audience and make it more palatable. And that this is then the project of moving from the Mizan to the Ihya. Now that's where I have a very different view. Again, this would take a lot more time to substantiate, but basically my view has come to be that Mizan is a a sketch that Al-Ghazali provided for himself and for a broader audience of basically a kind of a philosophical ethics for in a very kind of schematized way, fashion, and that it was one that he himself found unsatisfactory, that it left him dissatisfied with the lack of, precisely because there's a lack of integration with Muslim religious life. And I think that this goes much deeper than just kind of providing window dressing, so to speak, or putting some examples on kind of dressing it up in the theory in Islamic or ornamentation. I think that there's a much deeper way again in which Al-Ghazali himself came to think that okay, that this is lacking in a grounds of thinking again about the sort of the way in which a Muslim's life is ordained in sort of specific acts and how those are supposed to mold the soul. And that's then where he's in subsequent kind of phases, beginning most prominently with the Ihya, has to proceed. That being said, it is not unuseful. It's not useless in terms of, again, most of what is said in the Mizan, as far as it goes, remains as a backdrop. That if you read the Ihya and then you're kind of thinking, okay, what's the theoretical background to this? If you go to the Mizan, you'll often find things that look very useful. So again, even a latter day reader will often find it, I think, useful to be reading one in light of the other.
Thank you so much for that. It's very enlightening. There's a question for you in the chat box. I'll come back to that. Dr. Arjan, what do you think of the conception of a Hanbali Sufism?
Yeah, I think actually I'm right now preparing a larger project for the coming years to indeed study the relationship between the Hanbali school and Sufism. So I'm identifying a lot of different figures throughout the history of the Hanbali school who have somehow been affiliated with Sufism or have definitely been Sufis and have written on Sufism. And there's a lot to say on this. But when it comes to, for instance, Al-Ansari, it was clear that he was Hanbali. I mean, he was very passionate about it, and he has something like a line of poetry where he says something like وَوَصِيَّتِي لِلنَّاسِ أَنْ يَتَحَنْبَلُوا. So my advice to people is to become Hanbali. But I haven't read his Manazil al-Sa'irin completely, but I doubt that it really has a deep connection to Hanbali theology in the way that you will find in the works of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. And even when sometimes Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim as well, I think, though I'm not as well read in Ibn al-Qayyim as Professor Anjum, for instance. But I feel that often when they want to claim a certain Sufi individual, they sort of force their own viewpoints on that individual. So this is what you see in Sharh Futuh al-Ghayb of Ibn Taymiyyah, where he discusses the Futuh al-Ghayb of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. I think they had something of a project to sort of traditionalize Sufism, and this is above all clear in really under the guise of Sufism in the person of Imad ad-Din al-Wasti. He was also a follower and friend of Ibn Taymiyyah and the Sheikh of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah in Sufism. And my book is about him. And there I really tried to show that indeed he tried to make Sufism fully compatible with traditionalism. And I think sort of this is what their Jama'ah tried to do indeed. But I think they failed. I think in the end, the Hanbalis, they, for the most part, they were integrated into the overall Sufism of the context in which they lived. So we see, for instance, at a certain point that Hanbalis join these different turuq, and there's nothing really particularly Hanbali about being part of that tariqah. So they sort of merge with the popular trend. And I think this whole project of Hanbalizing or traditionalizing Sufism was not the kind of success that they hoped for. But this is my hypothesis, and this is what I want to work on for the coming years.
Thank you for that. Fantastic preliminary remarks, and we look forward to hearing more on that topic. For Dr. Tenali, we have a question from Professor Heck. It says, do you have any ideas about Ghazali's monistic outlook, as discussed by Trieger, in terms of its relation to his virtue ethics approach?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And Arjan, I really look forward to your work. I have to say that's absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much.
So the monistic outlook here has to do with this whole question again about, okay, so in what ways does Al-Ghazali's cosmology and metaphysics influence his understanding of, okay, where do we end up as human beings in the end, and kind of what's attainable for us, and so on. And so there's this question about, okay, so what was ultimately Al-Ghazali's own understanding of what was his understanding of a kind of the order of reality, is a really vexed one. What I'll say here at this point, in a sense, is simply this. Al-Ghazali does very clearly discuss the kind of the basic dichotomy of the kind of the bottom up and top down kind of approaches to how we view the world, which is to say again that much of our lives is spent in toiling in kind of trying to get from those individualized viewpoints to which I kind of referred again, the ways in which our just psychophysiological condition and all of our kind of earthly foibles limit our vision. So to a point of view where we could simply kind of see things as they flow from God's viewpoint, in which case then kind of something we see creation through God, not God through creation. And if we reach that kind of more exalted viewpoint, then something else takes hold, at least momentarily, at least potentially, completely. So there are these hints. What I find, in a sense, I have to say, this is more a matter of personal predilection. I tend to think that the very fact that Al-Ghazali put so much effort, both in the Ihya and then also in subsequent works, such as the Treatise on God's Beautiful Names, where the kind of the becoming adorned with God's beautiful attributes, his names, is such a kind of a through line. The fact that he spends so much time in underlining the various ways in which we're only ever at the beginning of the ladder. There's always an infinite ascension and so on, leads me to kind of think that when he says that the way in which the attributes can only inhere in us, only in an incredibly kind of deficient fashion, no matter what we do, that none of, never mind God's essence, which would be the fully monistic outlook, even God's attributes, even God's beautiful names, we can only attain to a very incredibly partial kind of understanding of them, or an exemplification of them, means that I tend to go with a pretty kind of attenuated understanding of what Al-Ghazali thinks is possible or not.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that comprehensive answer. There's a comment from one of our colleagues here. This is not a question, but regarding the authenticity of the Mizan. If we look closely at the Mizan, we know that Al-Ghazali refers in several places in the Mizan to his work Ihya al-Ilm. The latter work is also attributed to Ghazali. So this seems to be further proof of what you were already saying, in the sense that we can consider Mizan al-Amal one of the genuine texts of Imam al-Ghazali. Thank
you. That's absolutely true, and it goes. This is actually something where Trieger has done the really nice work in tracing everything that was supposedly published in 1095 or thereabouts in terms of internal references. And of course, somebody could forge the Mizan and still put a reference to the Miyar al-Ilm there, but then if Al-Ghazali himself then refers to the Mizan in other works, then that starts to look more convincing. Because then somebody would have to erase the authentic Mizan and replace it with the forgery Mizan, which starts to look like a lot of work.
All right.
Okay, we've exhausted the questions that we have so far. We have some from the previous session, and perhaps I think they might be of some considerable relevance to this session also. The question initially was for Dr. Harith related to Al-Ghazali and Hakim al-Tirmidhi conceptualize the qalb as the command post of the human body within which the heart acts as a source of perception, insight, and holds a dominant role. When it comes to al-aql, Al-Ghazali defines two types: the human intellectual potential to recognize reality, and secondly, one which makes the aql a sort of synonym for the qalb, wherein which it is interpreted as the human faculty to perceive knowledge. In other words, there's a theory of two aqls here, which is also prevalent in other sources. Can you explain Al-Makki and Sulami's thoughts? And possibly, Tanali, could you explain also Imam al-Ghazali's relationship between the aql and the qalb?
Hello, thank you for the question. You mentioned Sulami, so I don't know if that question was also addressed to Dr. Well as well, but I'll try to briefly answer the question on Makki. So the relationship for Makki between the aql and the qalb is that the aql is kind of the repository, so kind of locus in which the different khawatir occur. Whereas the aql itself is kind of, again, this is where the naturalism of Makki's school of thought enter into it, a kind of disposition, right? Ghariza, I guess, going back to the traditionalist Dr. Mu'taz mentioned earlier. So the aql is created. I think the key thing for Makki, and I think I raised this in the question I raised for Dr. Kukkonen, is that the aql for Makki is created, whereas the qalb, being a repository of the different khawatir, would include the uncreated light of faith, iman, and yaqeen, certainty. And so therefore, in a sense, a purified qalb would be revealing the truth directly from the uncreated light of God, whereas aql by itself can't do this. And he actually repeatedly says in many places in the Qut that the created cannot really understand the uncreated. So therefore, in order to even fully understand God in a true sense, or to have true faith, it needs to come from the light of God. And then actually, what's interesting is Makki doesn't just mean that this is the specialists, the khawas, or the possessors of ilm al-batin, or esoteric knowledge, but that includes the faith of the simple believer. So the genuine faith of the simple believer, as somebody who affirms simply what traditions and the Quran says, is also a kind of divine light. And I guess he was thinking of traditions like, the believer sees with the light of God. And because of that, actually, he's actually quite hard on mutakallimun, who try to kind of prioritize the aql as the kind of source of knowledge. So he really brings down the aql to kind of, being able to understand only creative things and take you only so far. To understand the divine, sometimes it's better, the faith of a simple believer is actually superior to that of a mutakallim who simply has kind of constructed proofs and arguments. I hope that answers the question. And while I'm at it, can I just quickly take the opportunity to thank the presenters? I also have a question for the other speaker, Dr. Post, about Hanbali Sufism. Could we be talking about two types of Hanbali theology here? So we've got, on the one hand, really, we go back to Khwaja Ansari and Abdul Qadir Jilani. We have a kind of very traditional kind of Hanbalism that doesn't engage at all with kalam and doesn't really try to provide a systematic theology other than affirmation of hadith and scripture. And on the other hand, going back to Abu Ya'la's systemization of Hanbali thought and also the madhab in terms of fiqh, we have this line going from Abu Ya'la to Ibn Aqil to Ibn al-Jawzi, who's a bit of an anomaly because he takes it even further, and then going back to Ibn Taymiyyah and gang. So it's actually two types of Hanbali theology we're talking about here in relation to tasawwuf. Thank you.
Yeah, can I say a word about the... Sorry. Oh, sorry.
If I could make a quick comment about the qalb and the aql, I'll just say I was more confident about Sulami's position on this a few days ago than I am right now. In some places, he seems to have this notion of the four spiritual centers as they develop among some later Sufis. The nafs, the qalb, the ruh, the sir. Although he's not as systematic about it. When I was looking at Uyub and Nafs, and he's got this tripartite schema of the soul with the soul at peace, the Nafs mutma'inna, I wondered, why doesn't he refer to one of the Quranic verses that employs that root? Because that's a Quranic root. So I checked the commentary, and in Haqa'iq al-Tafsir, one of the verses that employs that root, he transmits a commentary from the Twisteri line about the 4 different kinds of the heart, where within the heart you have the qalb and the fu'ad and the lub and the sadr, and I went, oh, it's obviously the difficulty with someone who's fundamentally a compiler is trying to sort out, okay, which of the material he's transmitting accurately reflects his own position, but it's a more complicated question now than I thought it was very recently. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, can I respond?
Yes, please, Arjan, please go ahead.
I actually, I'll respond to Ustaz Harith, and also I want to add something to this discussion to make it more complicated, perhaps, but also ask a question back to all of you, because in my research on al-Wasiti, I found that he makes a distinction between the body, the nafs, the aql, the qalb, and the ruh. And in that order, the Sufi is supposed to sort of tame each and every aspect of the human self. So beginning with the body, and then with the nafs, then the aql, and then the qalb, and the highest peak is reached by means of the ruh. And it's through even though a lot of the mashahid, the contemplations of the sifat that al-Wasiti discusses are through the heart, the most divine attainment of manifestation of God's reality, where a servant really becomes an abd in Abdullah, an abd of the Ism al-Azam. This is through the ruh, and it's not possible to reach this through the heart, al-Wasiti says. So that's, I was always wondering, because I'm not too well versed in earlier Sufism, whether this idea goes back much further than al-Wasiti. So that's a question to you. And going back to the issue of Hanbali theology and Sufism, I don't think there are a lot of instances where the two are actively merged. And we find this in Ibn Taymiyyah al-Wasiti and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. But for instance, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani in his Ghunya, I mean, he just has all these chapters which have nothing to do with Sufism, and then only in the final kitab he starts to discuss Sufism. And he doesn't really link it to theology as far as I could tell. So I think this is very rare in the Jama'at of Ibn Taymiyyah, that they're actively trying to put Sufism on this basis of Hanbali theology, but Hanbali theology as understood by Ibn Taymiyyah and his companions. So, for instance, al-Wasiti, but also Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Taymiyyah himself, also they talk of the mashhad al-Uluhiyya or Ilahiyya and Rububiyya. These things become like visions, like contemplations of the heart. So he's incorporating this theology into Sufism. But for overall in the Hanbali school, I don't think that's been done like that. Though of course this will require a lot more research. And indeed, the Hanbali school is very diverse in theology. There is, of course, this claim that there is something as a theology, but even for all the other schools, there are so many differences among the Ash'aris, and the same is for, I would say there are a lot more manifestations than only two when it comes to Hanbali theology, and indeed some are much more kalam inclined and others are not. So that's also a topic in itself that deserves much more attention, which I hope to do also with PhDs and postdocs in the coming years.
Mu'taz, it seems you want to share something with us.
Sorry, I was just sharing with you the page from Ghazali. Ghazali is Ihya. So he's referring to al-aql as that he said that the problem is the key problem that it has 4 definitions. 4 معان here. Number 1 is الوصف الذي يفارق الإنسان بسائر البهائم, and he quoted المحاسبي here in this context. And the second one is العلوم التي تخرج إلى الوجود في ذات الطفل المميز بجواز الجائزات واستحالة المستحيلات. And, الثالث علوم تستفاد من التجارب. والرابع أن تنتهي قوة تلك الغريزة إلى أن يعرف عواقب الأمور ويقمع الشهوة الداعية إلى اللذة العاجلة ويدخرها. So these are the 4 definitions. So you can translate it.
That is so very kind of you, offering me to translate those finals. What struck me though is that the 4th one can only reach some kind of notion of spiritual purification, but nothing more actually. I think we're approaching the end of time, but I'll give the opportunity to the other speakers to respond to Dr. Arjan's question about earlier Sufism and how it relates to notions of the heart and the soul and the sir and all of those things, if they'd like to comment. If not, I might comment.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Post. Sorry, sorry.
Please.
Would someone like to go first? Yeah, I'll just quickly, thank you for your comprehensive answer about the Hanbali theology, and I look forward to the rest of your research, see the rest of your research as well. Just to if I can add, for Makki, Ruh is one of the locations of the Khawatir, so that would be like Ruh and Nafs are different locations where the angelic and the demonic forces reveal the different Khawatir. So it would be part of the Qalb, at least for Makki. But then, of course, there's all this stuff that Junaid talks about in his Rasail on Ruh and the dangers of being stuck in that world of Arwah as well. That, I mean, I'm not going to pretend I understand Junaid's writing. So when someone comes along and is able to unveil those for us, then perhaps that could be another interesting area for discussion. But yeah, that's my 10 cents worth to the discussion. Thank you for your question.
Perhaps that person can initiate us with the khilqa, because I would also like to know those things.
I'll let you know when I come across it. You should let me know if you find him.
Sure.
Or her. Thank you.
I don't have anything to add. I would love to hear Dr. Picken's comments.
That's all very kind of you. Indeed, if you look at just the notion of the heart, you will find Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, who we have one of the experts in the audience, and his work on Al-Farq Bayn al-Sadr wal-Qalbi wa-Fu'adi wa-Sir. So there's a difference between the chest, the heart, the Fu'ad, which we can say the inner heart chambers, or in some people call it the pericardium in the physiological sense, and then the Sir, which is the hidden of the hidden. And each of these has a state of the nafs and has a state of humanity. So this is just one example of an author talking about the states of the heart. And then you also have the notions. Let's look at the concept of dhikr. Yani many Sufis will talk about dhikr al-lisan. So this is the employment of the body. Then they will say dhikr al-qalb. So there is the remembrance of the heart. Then there's the levels of the heart that I just mentioned. And then there's the sir, dhikr al-sir. Then there's dhikr al-akhfa, the innermost hidden. And then there's dhikr of the ruh. So we all indeed need initiating soon to work all this stuff out. But thank you so much. It's been a fascinating session, and it's been my absolute pleasure to be your host, actually. And I really think this was, for me, it was an eye-opener, and indeed, I hope it opens up to you lots more conversations to have regarding these fascinating topics, these fascinating books, and these fascinating authors. And again, I'd like to thank you on behalf of Kalle and on behalf of the University of Leuven. There is a program which will continue tomorrow. And of course, we hope that you will be equally active and participant in that. And thank you to the panelists in particular the four speakers who were really the instigators of our engagement with these topics today. Thank you so much, everyone. I'd like to stop here. Call the session to an end.
Thank you, everyone, for the great presentations. We hope that you found the discussions of the conference today very useful and enjoyable. We would appreciate if you could share your thoughts with us to help advance the knowledge and the moral dialogue on these important issues. Please use the hashtag CILE2020 on our Twitter page and Facebook. If you need to know more about the conference agenda tomorrow, kindly refer to the booklet on our website, cilecenter.org. Thank you once again for your attendance and contribution, and we look forward to see you tomorrow, inshallah, at 1 p.m. Doha time.